What if everything you've ever been told about the beginning of civilization is wrong? Not slightly wrong, not missing a few details, but fundamentally, completely wrong. What if the first civilization on Earth didn't rise slowly out of primitive tribes, but instead came after something far older, far more advanced, something that was erased so completely that almost no trace of it was meant to survive? And here is the question that should disturb you more than any other. What if it wasn't erased by time, but by choice? Before we go any further, take a second. Look around you. Your room. Your phone. The buildings outside. The systems that keep everything running. Now, imagine all of it gone. Not destroyed in a visible way, but removed. Hidden. Buried. As if it never existed. That is exactly what we may be looking at when we study the earliest chapters of human history. Welcome. If you enjoy exploring the hidden side of history, the parts that don't quite fit, the questions no one wants to ask, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These stories travel further than we ever expect, and sometimes they reach exactly who they're meant to. Now, let's begin. According to everything we're taught, civilization begins around 6,000 years ago, a place between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, a land we call Mesopotamia. This is where the Sumerians appear. They build cities, they create writing, they develop laws, trade, religion. They organize society in ways that feel strangely complete, as if they didn't just invent civilization, but inherited it. For over a century, this narrative has remained almost untouched. Before Sumer, nothing. Just scattered tribes, hunters, gatherers, small groups of humans surviving, not building. It's a clean story, a logical one, progress from simple to complex, step by step. But there's a problem. The deeper we look, the less this story holds, because across the world, in places far older than Sumer, we keep finding things that shouldn't exist. Structures too advanced for their time. Knowledge that appears out of nowhere. And most disturbing of all, evidence that something was intentionally hidden. Not destroyed in chaos, not lost to erosion. Hidden. Carefully. Methodically. Deliberately. Imagine discovering a massive structure buried underground. Not collapsed. Not ruined. But intentionally covered. Protected. Preserved. Not by nature. By the people who built it. Now ask yourself, why would a civilization go through the effort of creating something monumental, only to bury it themselves? Not abandon it, not destroy it, bury it, as if they wanted it to be found, but not too soon, as if they were leaving something behind, a message, a warning, or perhaps a secret. Because once you accept the possibility that something was hidden on purpose, the entire timeline of human history begins to shift. Suddenly, we're not looking at the birth of civilization. We're looking at its aftermath. And that leads us to a far more unsettling idea. What if the Sumerians weren't the first? What if they were the survivors? Or worse, what if they were the ones who forgot? In the next part, we're going to look closely at the Sumerians themselves, not as the beginning of civilization, but as a clue that something came before them. Something they may not have fully understood. Something they may have inherited without knowing where it came from. The Sumerians are supposed to be the beginning. That's what we're told. The first cities, the first writing system, the first organized religion, the first complex society. Everything starts with them. But when you look closer, something feels off. Because civilizations don't usually appear fully formed. They evolve, slowly, messily, with mistakes, experiments, failures. But the Sumerians? They arrive, complete, Writing doesn't begin as crude symbols and gradually improve over thousands of years. It appears already structured, already functional, already capable of recording law, trade, and complex ideas. Their cities aren't primitive settlements that slowly grow into something larger. They are organized from the start. Ziggurats, administrative systems, priesthoods, trade networks stretching across vast regions. It's as if they skipped the early stages entirely, as if they didn't invent civilization, but remembered it. And that raises a dangerous question. Where did that knowledge come from? Because even the Sumerians themselves never claimed to be the first. In their own texts, they speak of beings called the Anunnaki, figures described not just as gods, but as bringers of knowledge, teachers, civilizers. They claim that kingship was lowered from heaven. Think about that phrasing. Not created, not developed, lowered, given. As if civilization was something delivered, not discovered. And it doesn't stop there. Across multiple tablets, there are references to a time before Sumer, a time when the world was different, a time that ended with a catastrophe so vast that it reset everything. You've heard this story before. A great flood, a destruction of the world, a wiping away of everything that came before. But here's where it gets strange. This story doesn't belong only to the Sumerians. It appears everywhere. Different continents, different cultures, no contact between them. And yet, they all describe something eerily similar. A world destroyed, a few survivors, and knowledge carried over. That alone would be interesting. But it becomes unsettling when you realize something else. The Sumerians didn't just inherit myths, they inherited precision. Their understanding of astronomy was far beyond what we would expect. They tracked planetary movements with accuracy that suggests long-term observation, not decades, not centuries, but potentially thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. But how? A newly formed civilization shouldn't have that kind of data. You can't observe long cycles of the sky unless you've been watching for a very long time. Or unless someone was watching before you and passed it on. Now combine that with their mathematical system, a base 60 structure still embedded in how we measure time today. Minutes, seconds, angles. It's not intuitive. It's not simple. It's highly structured, highly intentional. Again, it feels less like invention and more like inheritance. And then there's the King List, a document that records rulers going back tens of thousands of years. Kings who supposedly ruled for impossibly long periods, thousands of years each. At first glance, it sounds like myth, exaggeration, symbolism. But what if it's something else? What if it's a distorted memory, a corrupted record of something real, something that existed before the timeline we accept? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If even a fraction of this is based on reality, then Sumer isn't the beginning. It's a continuation, a fragment, a reconstruction built on the ruins of something much older. And if that's the case, then we're not studying the birth of civilization. We're studying what came after the fall. In the next part, we're going to examine one of the most unsettling pieces of evidence ever discovered. A place that shouldn't exist, a structure older than civilization itself, built with purpose, used for thousands of years, and then buried, not by time, by its creators. In 1994, something was uncovered that should not exist, not according to everything we thought we knew, not according to the timeline we trusted. In the southeast of modern-day Turkey, on a quiet, unremarkable hill, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavations at a site known as Göbekli Tepe. At first glance, it didn't look like much, just a rise in the landscape, Stones scattered across the surface, nothing that suggested it would change our understanding of human history. But as they started digging, the truth began to emerge. Massive stone pillars, perfectly carved, arranged in precise circular formations, some weighing up to 20 tons, each one covered in intricate carvings, animals, symbols, abstract patterns that seemed to carry meaning, but refused to explain themselves. This wasn't random. This wasn't primitive. This was intentional, engineered, planned. And then came the date, around 11,600 years ago. Let that sink in. This structure is older than Stonehenge by over 6,000 years. Older than the pyramids by nearly 7,000. Built at a time when, according to the official story, humans were still simple hunter-gatherers. No agriculture, no cities, no writing, no organized labor force. And yet, here stood one of the most complex, monumental structures ever discovered. Who built it? How did they coordinate the labor? How did they carve and transport stones of that size? How did they design something so precise, without the tools we believe they didn't have? These questions alone are unsettling, but they're not the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part is what happened next. After being used for nearly 2,000 years, Göbekli Tepe was buried, not collapsed, not destroyed. Buried, deliberately, carefully, layer by layer. Ton after ton of earth, stone, and debris placed over the structures until they disappeared completely beneath the ground. This wasn't erosion. This wasn't nature reclaiming the site. This was a decision. A massive, coordinated effort to hide something that had stood for generations. And they didn't just abandon it. They preserved it. The pillars weren't shattered. The carvings weren't defaced. Everything was sealed, as if someone wanted it protected from time itself. Ask yourself, why would a civilization build something this advanced, only to bury it themselves? Why invest centuries of effort into creating a monument, just to erase it from the surface of the earth? There are only a few possibilities. One, it was ritual, a symbolic act. But what kind of ritual requires the destruction, or rather, the concealment, of such a massive and meaningful structure? Another possibility, they were trying to protect it. From erosion? Unlikely. From other humans? Maybe. But there's a third possibility, the one that refuses to go away. They weren't hiding it from the world. They were hiding it for the future, as if they knew something was coming. Something that would wipe everything clean. Something they couldn't stop, but could prepare for. Because if you look at Göbekli Tepe not as a temple, but as a message, everything changes. The carvings begin to feel less decorative, and more like symbols, records, encodings of knowledge we don't yet understand. The alignment of the structures, less random, and more intentional. Possibly astronomical, possibly mathematical, possibly something even more complex. And then there's the timeline. 11,600 years ago places us right at the end of the last ice age. Right at the moment when something catastrophic happened to the planet. A sudden shift, a violent disruption, a break in the natural order, which raises a terrifying possibility. What if the people who built Göbekli Tepe weren't primitive? What if they were survivors? The last remnants of something older, something more advanced, trying to preserve what they could before everything changed. And what if burying this place wasn't an ending, but a warning? Because in the next part, we're going to look at what was happening to the Earth at that exact moment in time, and why it might explain not only Göbekli Tepe, but the disappearance of an entire civilization. Around 12,800 years ago, something happened to this planet. Not gradually, not over centuries. Suddenly, violently. and on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. Today, scientists call this period the Younger Dryas. On paper, it sounds harmless, technical, distant. But what it represents is anything but. At the end of the last ice age, the Earth was warming, glaciers were retreating, temperatures were rising, life was stabilizing. Everything was moving in one direction, forward. And then, it stopped. Almost instantly, the planet was thrown back into extreme cold. Temperatures dropped, glaciers began expanding again, entire ecosystems collapsed. Large animal species, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, vanished. But the cold wasn't the only problem, because buried in layers of soil across the world, scientists began finding something strange. A thin, dark band, known as the black layer. It appears in North America, Europe, and parts of Asia, always dating to the same period, always marking the same moment in time. And inside that layer are materials that should not be there. Microspheres of melted metal, nanodiamonds, high concentrations of platinum and iridium, all substances that form under extreme heat. The kind of heat you don't get from normal Earth processes. The kind of heat you get from impact, from something hitting the planet. Fast, hard, with unimaginable energy. In 2007, a group of researchers proposed a theory that changed everything. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth may have been struck, not by one object, but by fragments of a comet. Multiple impacts, possibly hitting massive ice sheets that covered North America and parts of Europe. Imagine what that means. A high-speed collision with ice kilometers thick, instant melting, vast amounts of water released in moments, floods unlike anything we've ever seen, walls of water sweeping across continents, carrying rock, debris, entire landscapes with them. And then, the aftermath. Dust and ash thrown into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, triggering a sudden global cooling. Years, maybe decades, of darkness and cold. If a civilization existed at that time, it wouldn't just struggle, it would collapse, completely. Especially if it lived near coastlines. Because during the Ice Age, sea levels were much lower than today. Entire regions that are now underwater were once land, fertile, habitable, perfect for building cities. And all of it, gone, submerged beneath rising oceans, erased from view, almost as if it never existed. Think about it. If our modern civilization were suddenly hit by something like this, what would remain after 10,000 years? Steel would rust, concrete would crumble, glass would shatter, wood would decay. Only the largest, most durable structures would survive, and even those would be buried, broken, or hidden beneath layers of earth and water. Now imagine a civilization even older than ours, less reliant on materials that last, more vulnerable to sudden collapse. How much would be left? Maybe almost nothing, except fragments, pieces that don't quite fit, structures like Göbekli Tepe, buried, preserved, waiting. And this is where the pieces begin to connect. Because if a global catastrophe really happened, if it really wiped out a civilization, then Göbekli Tepe starts to look very different. Not as a mystery, but as a response, a reaction to something known, something feared, something expected. Because you don't bury knowledge unless you believe it needs to survive you. And you don't preserve something so carefully unless you think everything else is about to be lost. Which leads to a disturbing idea. What if the builders of Göbekli Tepe knew this was coming? What if they saw the signs? What if they understood the cycles of the sky, the movements of objects beyond Earth, well enough to predict what was about to happen? And if they did, then Göbekli Tepe wasn't just a structure. It was a preparation, a final act, a way to send something forward through time. But here's where it becomes even more unsettling. Because if they knew, and if they prepared, then the question isn't just what destroyed them. The real question is, why didn't they try to stop it? In the next part, we're going to explore a possibility that changes everything. What if they couldn't stop it? Because what was coming wasn't the first time it had happened. There is something deeply unsettling about patterns, not coincidences, not isolated events, but patterns that repeat across time. Because once you start looking at the past through that lens, history stops feeling random and starts feeling cyclical. Let's go back to the catastrophe. 12,800 years ago. A sudden shift, a violent disruption, a near-extinction level event. But here's the problem. Events like this don't just happen once. We know this from geology. We know this from impact craters. We know this from extinction records buried deep within the Earth. Our planet has been hit before, again and again and again. Some impacts were small, some were devastating, and at least one ended the age of the dinosaurs. So the idea that a comet or asteroid could destroy a civilization is not speculation, it's precedent. Now think about what that means for a civilization advanced enough to study the sky. A civilization that tracked stars, cycles, planetary movements. If they existed, they wouldn't just observe the heavens. They would learn from them. They would recognize patterns. They would notice that certain events return. Because celestial mechanics is predictable. Objects move in cycles. Orbits repeat. Trajectories can be calculated, which leads to a chilling possibility. What if the catastrophe that ended their world wasn't unexpected? What if it was known, predicted, calculated, long before it happened? Imagine living in a civilization that understands this. You look up at the sky, and you know, not guess, not fear, know that something is coming, something you cannot stop, something that has happened before and will happen again. What do? You don't panic. You don't try to fight something beyond your reach. You prepare, you preserve, you choose what survives. Because if you can't save your world, you can still send something forward. And suddenly, everything begins to make sense. Göbekli Tepe. Buried, not destroyed. Carefully sealed, not abandoned. As if it was meant to survive the event. Not for them, but for whoever came after. But that's just one site, one piece of a much larger puzzle. Because around the world, there are structures that don't fit. Massive stone constructions that seem far too advanced for their supposed age. Take Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon. At its foundation lie stone blocks, weighing up to 800 tons, some even larger. Cut, transported, lifted into place with precision. Even today, moving something like that requires specialized equipment. Cranes, engineering, infrastructure. So how was it done thousands of years ago? Or look at the Great Sphinx in Egypt. Its body shows signs of water erosion. Not wind, not sand. Water. Heavy, prolonged rainfall. But Egypt hasn't experienced that kind of climate for thousands of years, which suggests the Sphinx may be far older than we think. And then there are the polygonal walls in places like Peru. Massive stones, cut at irregular angles, fitted together so perfectly that not even a blade can pass between them. No mortar, no gaps, just precision, far beyond what we expect from ancient tools. These structures are scattered across the planet, different cultures, different locations, no clear connection. And yet, they share something in common, a level of sophistication that feels out of place, as if they belong to a different chapter of history, one that we haven't fully uncovered. Or worse, one that was deliberately erased. Because if a global civilization once existed, if it spanned coastlines now lost beneath the ocean, if it was destroyed in a catastrophe, then what we see today might not be its peak, but its remains, fragments left behind, pieces that survived, by accident or by design. And here's where it becomes even more unsettling. Because if they understood the cycles, if they predicted the impact, if they chose to preserve knowledge instead of trying to stop the event, then maybe they knew something we don't. Something about the nature of these catastrophes. Something about their inevitability. Because maybe the real reason they didn't try to stop it is because they couldn't. Not because they lacked technology, but because the event itself was part of something larger. Something beyond a single impact. A repeating process. A cycle tied to the movement of the solar system itself. And if that's true, then what happened 12,800 years ago wasn't just the end of their world. It was one point in a much longer pattern. A pattern that may not be over. In the next part, we're going to explore the evidence that ancient knowledge was not just preserved in stone, but hidden in stories, encoded in myths, passed down across thousands of years, as warnings, disguised as legends. Long before history was written, it was remembered. Not in books, not in records, but in stories, passed from voice to voice, generation after generation, across thousands of years. And here's the strange part. No matter where you look in the world, those stories begin to sound the same. Different cultures, different languages, no contact between them. And yet, the same patterns appear again and again. A great flood, a destruction of the world, a few survivors, and beings who came after. Teachers, guides, civilizers. In ancient Mesopotamia, they were called the Anunnaki. In Egypt, there were the followers of Horus. In Central America, Quetzalcoatl, a figure described as a bringer of knowledge who came from across the sea. In the Andes, Viracocha. In India, the sages, the rishis. Everywhere, the same idea. Someone came after everything was destroyed, and they brought knowledge with them. Now ask yourself something. Why would so many disconnected cultures tell the same story? Coincidence? Maybe. Human imagination? Possibly. But there's a problem with that explanation. Because these stories don't just share themes. They share details, specific ones. Descriptions of floods that cover the entire world. Instructions to preserve knowledge. Warnings about cycles. Even references to events in the sky. Objects falling. Fire from above. Darkness. If this were just mythology, it wouldn't need to be so consistent. But if it's memory, distorted, fragmented, passed down through thousands of years, then it starts to make sense. Because when people survive something they don't fully understand, they don't write scientific reports. They tell stories. And over time, those stories change. Details fade. Meanings shift. But the core survives. And sometimes, it hides more than we realize. Take the flood myth. It appears in nearly every major culture on Earth. The Sumerians told of Ziusudra. The Akkadians told of Utnapishtim. The Bible tells of Noah. The Greeks had Deucalion. India had Manu. Even indigenous cultures across the Americas tell similar stories. A great flood, a chosen survivor, a warning before destruction, and a new beginning. For a long time, this was dismissed. Local floods, shared archetypes, cultural coincidence. But the scale doesn't match, the consistency doesn't match, and the timing doesn't match. Because many of these stories trace back to roughly the same period. The end of the Ice Age, around 12,000 years ago. The same time as the Younger Dryas, the same time as the catastrophe. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Some of these myths don't just describe destruction, they describe knowledge, advanced knowledge, hidden within symbolic language. In ancient Indian texts, there are descriptions of flying machines, vimanas, detailed enough to sound less like fantasy and more like misunderstood technology. Weapons capable of destroying entire cities in a single blast. Land rendered uninhabitable, people falling sick, losing hair, their bodies failing. Descriptions that feel disturbingly familiar. Elsewhere in Greek mythology, we hear of Prometheus, a figure who gives fire, knowledge, to humanity, and is punished for it. In the story of Adam and Eve, knowledge is forbidden. In the myth of Icarus, flying too close to the sun leads to destruction. Over and over again, the same message appears. Knowledge is dangerous. Power must be controlled. Some things should not be used. Why would ancient cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, all carry the same warning? Unless they were told. And if they were told, then who told them? Because suddenly, the idea of gods begins to shift. Not supernatural beings, not divine entities, but survivors. The last remnants of a civilization that came before. People who had knowledge, technology, understanding far beyond what remained of the world after the catastrophe. Imagine encountering someone like that as a primitive tribe. They teach you agriculture. They show you how to build. They explain the stars. To you, they are not human. They are something more. And over time, they become gods. Their teachings become myths. Their warnings become legends. But here's the most unsettling part. If these stories really are echoes of the past, then they weren't just meant to explain the world. They were meant to warn us. Because in the next part, we're going to look at something even more disturbing. The possibility that the knowledge left behind wasn't fully given, that some of it was hidden, locked away. Not because it was lost, but because it was too dangerous to be remembered. If knowledge survived the fall of a civilization, then the next question is inevitable. How much of it was actually passed on? Because when you listen carefully to the myths, there's something strange beneath them. Something subtle. Something easy to miss. The knowledge is never given freely. It's controlled, limited, filtered, as if those who carried it forward were choosing what humanity was allowed to know and what it wasn't. Think about it. In every story, the gods or teachers bring certain things. Farming, basic construction, astronomy, language, enough to rebuild society, enough to survive. But never everything. Never the full picture. Never the kind of knowledge that could destroy. And that pattern repeats everywhere. In ancient Egypt, knowledge was reserved for priesthoods, hidden within temples, encoded in symbols that only the initiated could understand. In Mesopotamia, sacred knowledge belonged to scribes and elites. In India, wisdom was passed from teacher to student, only after initiation. In Greece, mystery schools guarded teachings behind layers of symbolism. Even in later traditions, alchemy, hermeticism, esoteric orders, the same structure exists. Knowledge is not lost. It is hidden, protected, restricted. But why? Why go through the effort of preserving knowledge, only to hide it? There are only two real answers. Either it was too valuable, or too dangerous. And if we follow the logic of everything we've seen so far, the answer becomes harder to ignore. Because imagine you are one of the survivors. You have seen your world end. You have watched your civilization collapse. You understand why it happened. You understand what led to it. And now, you stand in a new world, surrounded by people who have none of that knowledge, none of that power. Would you give it back to them? Would you teach them everything? Or would you hesitate? Because if the destruction of your world was caused, not just by nature, but by something your own civilization created, then giving that knowledge away again would be the same as repeating the mistake. And suddenly, the myths begin to sound different. Not like stories, but like warnings. Take the idea of forbidden knowledge. It appears everywhere. The fruit in Eden, Prometheus stealing fire, the fall from grace, the punishment for reaching too far. These aren't just moral lessons, they are patterns, echoes of something real, a boundary that should not be crossed, because it has been crossed before, and it didn't end well. Now think about the structures again. Göbekli Tepe, buried, sealed, preserved, not destroyed, as if something was placed there intentionally, but not meant to be accessed immediately, as if it required time or understanding, or perhaps the right moment. And what if that's not the only place? What if there are others, hidden beneath layers of earth, submerged beneath oceans, sealed within mountains, not lost, but waiting? Because if a civilization truly wanted to pass something forward, but control when it was discovered, this is exactly how they would do it. They wouldn't leave clear instructions. They wouldn't make it obvious. They would hide it, protect it, and trust that eventually someone would be ready. But here's where it becomes uncomfortable. Because if knowledge was hidden on purpose, then we have to consider another possibility. What if we're not supposed to find it yet? What if the reason it was buried was not just to preserve it, but to delay it? Because maybe the greatest danger wasn't the catastrophe itself, but what came after. The rebuilding, the moment when civilization rises again and reaches the same level of power, the same level of understanding, the same level of risk. Which brings us to something we haven't asked yet, something far more unsettling than anything before. What if the first civilization didn't just disappear? What if it made a decision, a conscious choice, to erase itself? In the next part, we're going to explore that possibility and why a civilization might decide that the safest thing it could do for the future was to make sure it would never be remembered. There is a moment in every civilization when it becomes powerful enough to destroy itself, not by accident, but by capability. And if everything we've explored so far is even partially true, then the first civilization reached that moment and crossed it. Because up until now, we've been asking the wrong question. We've been asking, what destroyed them? But maybe the better question is, what did they do before they disappeared? Because when you step back and look at the evidence, the buried structures, the controlled knowledge, the consistent warnings across cultures, a different picture begins to form. Not of a civilization that was simply wiped out, but of one that made decisions, deliberate ones, calculated ones, final ones. Imagine this scenario: a civilization that understands the sky, that predicts a catastrophic event, that knows destruction is coming. At that point, they have two choices: try to survive or try to preserve. And everything we've seen suggests they chose preservation. But preservation alone doesn't explain everything. Because if their only goal was survival, why erase so much? Why bury entire complexes? Why allow knowledge to fragment into myth instead of keeping it intact? Why not leave clear records, clear instructions, clear warnings? Unless clarity itself was the danger. Because knowledge doesn't just build civilizations, it accelerates them. It compresses time. It takes a society that would need thousands of years to develop and moves it forward in centuries or less. Now imagine giving that kind of acceleration to a civilization that isn't ready. A civilization that hasn't learned restraint, that hasn't developed wisdom at the same pace as its technology. What happens? You don't get progress. You get repetition, the same mistakes, the same misuse of power, the same collapse. And maybe that's exactly what they were trying to prevent. Not the end of civilization, but the speed at which it rises. Because if humanity rises too fast, it reaches the same dangerous point before it's ready. And if that point leads to destruction, then accelerating toward it is the worst thing you could do. So what do you do instead? You slow everything down. You remove the shortcuts. You hide the advanced knowledge. You force future generations to rebuild, step by step. You turn direct instruction into myth. You turn science into symbolism. You scatter fragments instead of leaving a complete system. Because that way, civilization still rises, but slowly, naturally, with time to adapt, time to mature, time to learn the lessons that can't be taught, only experienced. And suddenly, the silence of the past begins to make sense. It's not empty. It's controlled. What looks like absence might actually be restraint. And what looks like loss might actually be protection. Because if the first civilization truly understood the consequences of its own power, then its final act might not have been survival, or even preservation. It might have been containment. Containing knowledge, containing risk, containing the possibility of repeating the same mistake. But there's one detail that makes this even more disturbing. Because if they chose to limit knowledge, they didn't eliminate it completely. They left pieces, clues, fragments that could be rediscovered. Eventually. Which means they expected us to find them. At some point. At a certain stage of development. When we became capable enough to understand what they were trying to say. And maybe that moment is not in the distant future. Maybe it's now. Because look at where we are. We understand the atom. We manipulate genetics. We build systems that think. We are approaching the same threshold, the same level of power, the same level of risk, and at the same time, we're starting to uncover the past, Göbekli Tepe, ancient anomalies, patterns in myth, connections we couldn't see before. It's all happening, together, as if something is aligning, as if we are reaching a point where the message they left behind becomes relevant again. But here's the part that should make you uneasy. Because if they expected us to find this knowledge, then they also expected something else. That we would face the same choice, the same moment, the same test. And the question is, will we recognize it? Or will we do exactly what they did, without even realizing it? In the next part, we're going to confront the most unsettling possibility of all. Not that they were destroyed, not that they hid, but that they were hiding from something that might still exist. There is a detail hidden beneath everything we've discussed. That changes the entire story. Because up until now, we've assumed something simple, that whatever destroyed the first civilization is gone, finished, in the past. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the reason they hid their knowledge wasn't just to protect it from time, but to protect it from being found? Not by us, but by something else. Because there is a pattern in ancient myths that is often ignored. Not the floods, not the gods, but the conflict, stories of battles. Not between humans, but between beings. Wars in the sky. Weapons described as fire, light, thunder. Cities destroyed in moments. Entire regions rendered lifeless. At first it sounds symbolic, mythological. But when you compare these stories across cultures, they begin to align too closely. In Indian texts, there are descriptions of weapons that burn everything in their path. In Mesopotamian myths, there are accounts of divine conflict. In Greek mythology, the war between gods and titans reshapes the world. In Norse legends, Ragnarok ends with fire and destruction. Different places, different languages, same theme. A conflict so large, it alters the world itself. Now combine that with something else. The idea that knowledge was restricted, that certain things were deliberately hidden, that advanced understanding was not passed on freely. Why? Not just because it was dangerous, but because it could attract attention. Because knowledge is not neutral. It signals capability. It signals development. It signals presence. And if there was something out there, something watching, something that had already interacted with the first civilization, then knowledge itself could become a risk. Because the more advanced a civilization becomes, the more visible it becomes, not just on Earth, but beyond it. Now this may sound like speculation, but think about our own trajectory. We send signals into space, we build satellites, we explore beyond our planet. We are becoming detectable, and we assume that's harmless. That space is empty, silent, but we don't actually know that. Now, imagine a civilization before us, more advanced in some ways, more aware of the sky, more aware of what might exist beyond it. And then imagine they discovered something, not just cycles, not just impacts, but something else, something that made them realize that being visible was dangerous. Suddenly, the idea of hiding changes. It's not just about preserving knowledge. It's about concealing existence. Because if something had already come, or if something periodically returns, then the safest thing you could do is disappear. Erase your footprint. Leave nothing obvious behind. Nothing that signals intelligence. Nothing that draws attention. And that could explain something we haven't addressed yet. Why there is so little direct evidence. Why everything we find is fragmented, buried, ambiguous. Because clear evidence would defeat the purpose. It would announce, we are here. And if the first civilization learned that this was a mistake, then their final act might not have been survival, or even preservation. It might have been silence, intentional silence. But here's the part that should make you pause. Because if that's true, then everything we're doing today is the opposite. We are building, broadcasting, expanding, revealing ourselves, without fully understanding what that means. And maybe that's exactly the stage they reached, right before everything changed, right before they realized something they couldn't ignore, something that forced them to make a decision. Hide, or risk being seen. And if they chose to hide, then the question becomes unavoidable. What did they see? That made them afraid. In the next part, we're going to bring everything together. All the fragments, all the clues, all the patterns, and try to answer the question that started this journey. Why would a civilization choose to erase itself from history? At some point, it stopped being about survival and became about choice. Because when you put everything together, the buried structures, the restricted knowledge, the global myths, the evidence of catastrophe, the patterns in the sky, a single conclusion begins to emerge. Not certain, not proven, but impossible to ignore. The first civilization didn't just disappear. It made a decision, a final one. And that decision may have been this: to end itself on its own terms. Not in the sense of destruction, but in the sense of erasure. Because think about the alternatives they faced. They knew a catastrophe was coming, or recurring. They knew their world was fragile. They knew their knowledge was powerful and dangerous. They may have known something else was out there. Something that responded to that power, to that visibility, to that growth. So what options did they have? They could rebuild quickly, using all their knowledge, reaching the same level of power again, and risking the same outcome. Or they could start over, slowly, carefully, intentionally limiting themselves. But even that wasn't enough, because if the knowledge remained fully intact, if it was easily accessible, then sooner or later, someone would use it again. Someone would accelerate. Someone would reach the same threshold without understanding the consequences. So they did something radical, something almost unthinkable. They fragmented their own legacy. They buried what they built. They encoded what they knew. They turned clarity into mystery. They replaced instruction with myth. They made sure that the next civilization would not inherit their power, only fragments of it, and only when it was ready to understand. This wasn't destruction. It was control. Control over time, over knowledge, over the future. Because by forcing humanity to rediscover everything step by step, they changed the trajectory. They slowed the rise. They gave future generations something they may not have had themselves. Time. Time to develop not just technology, but awareness, responsibility, understanding. And maybe that was the real lesson. Not how to build, not how to calculate, but how to exist without destroying everything in the process. Because if their civilization ended in catastrophe, whether from the sky, from within, or from something beyond, then knowledge alone wasn't enough to save them, and they knew it. So they left us something different, not answers, but questions, not instructions, but puzzles, not clear history, but a trail. One that leads us slowly back to the same realization they reached. That power, without wisdom, is a dead end. Now look at where we are. We are uncovering their structures, decoding their myths, connecting patterns across continents. We are advancing faster than ever before, reaching levels of capability that would have been unimaginable just decades ago. And at the same time, we are standing at a threshold, the same kind of threshold they may have faced, the point where a civilization becomes powerful enough to determine its own fate. And maybe that's when the message becomes clear, because everything they left behind points to one idea. Not that they failed, but that they understood something too late and tried to pass that understanding forward. The question is, will we recognize it? Or will we reach the same point and make the same choice? In the final part, we're going to step back and look at what all of this means, not just for the past, but for us, right now. Now, step back for a moment. Forget the details. Forget the names, the places, the theories. Just look at the pattern. A civilization rises. It reaches a level of knowledge and power. Something happens. A catastrophe. A collapse. A disappearance. And then, fragments remain. Scattered. Buried. Encoded. Waiting. For thousands of years, we believed we were at the beginning of that story. The first. The only. The most advanced. But what if we're not? What if we are simply the next? Because everything we've uncovered points to a possibility that is both humbling and deeply unsettling. That before us, there was something else. Something capable. something aware, something that understood the world in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. And that something is gone, not completely erased, but reduced to whispers, stone, symbols, stories that sound like myths until you listen closely. And when you do, they begin to feel less like imagination and more like memory. A memory that survived, without context, without clarity, but with purpose. Because if this was just loss, it would be random, messy, incomplete. But what we see instead is structured, intentional, almost as if someone wanted it this way, not to hide the truth forever, but to delay it, to make sure it is found, only when it matters. And that brings us here, to this moment, because for the first time in history, we are in a position to see the pattern. We have the tools to explore beneath the surface, to scan the oceans, to analyze ancient materials, to compare myths across the entire planet. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture is forming. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to ask the question that changes everything. What if we are not discovering the past, but unlocking a message? A message left by a civilization that knew it would disappear, that understood its own limits, its own mistakes, and chose to leave behind something more valuable than monuments. A warning, because that is what all of this begins to feel like. Not a mystery to solve, but a signal to understand. A signal that says, we were here. We reached further than you can imagine, and we paid the price. Don't follow the same path, blindly. Look at our world today. We are more connected than ever, more powerful than ever, more capable than ever. We can reshape the planet. We can alter life itself. We can reach beyond Earth. And yet, we are still learning how to handle that power. Still learning how to exist without turning against ourselves. Still balancing on a line we don't fully understand. And maybe that's exactly where they stood. Right before everything changed. Right before they realized that knowledge alone is not enough. That progress without awareness leads somewhere very specific. Somewhere they had already seen. So they left us fragments, not answers. Because answers can be misused. But fragments force something else. They force us to think, to question, to slow down, to earn understanding instead of inheriting it. And maybe that's the point. Because if we are meant to find what they left behind, then we are also meant to decide what to do with it, to choose differently, or not. Because in the end, the most important part of this story isn't what happened to them, it's what happens to us. We are standing at the same threshold, the same level of possibility, the same level of risk, and the same question remains. What do we do with what we know? If you've made it this far, if you've followed this journey all the way to the end, then you're already part of that question. Because awareness is where it begins. Understanding is what comes next. And what we choose after that will define everything that comes after us. So take a moment, think about it, not just as a story, but as a possibility. Because if even a small part of this is true, then history is not behind us. It's repeating, quietly, patiently, waiting to see if this time will be different. If this journey made you think, really think, then don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? What do you believe happened? Because the next discovery might not come from the past. It might come from someone just like you. Good night, and until the next journey into the unknown.